What's up YouTube, with Clormo with another LFO tutorial talking about Alchemy LFO controls in this one. I want to keep this as short as possible, so I'm not going to be doing a lot of parameter tweaking. I'm going to leave that for the very end when I'm clear with all the other LFO and modulation control panel modes are covered. It's just a continuation obviously from the last video talking about the modulation section, going into that a little bit more on this one, and so on and so forth. As usual, if this is the first video that you see from my channel and you like what you see, I invite you to subscribe to keep on top of all my new releases. Like, dislike, comment, make questions. You can refer to the bottom of the video. That border graphic there is going to have everywhere that you can contact me and see my other work as far as writing and music goes. And as usual, I thank all of the subscribers that have recently subscribed and that keep supporting my work. And with that being said, let's go into the Logic Pro X window. This is what we're talking about here, the modulation section. If you are a new viewer, today specifically I'm going to start talking about these control panel options here. The first one is the LFO. LFO, what that means is a low frequency oscillator, which is no different from all the other synths and samplers that different music making programs and specifically Logic Pro has. So if you haven't watched one of my videos before, I have already covered some of the other synths in Logic Pro X, and all of these have an LFO mode, or most of them do have an LFO in some way, shape, or form. This one in Alchemy has different controls, obviously. One note that I want to make here is that this LFO module in Alchemy does not have a depth control in itself. The depth of the modulation is controlled here in the modulation rack controls with this knob here called depth. If you need to understand a little bit more about that, I invite you to watch the previous video in this series and get more information on that. Now let me just go right away with the different parameters. Here you have this pop-up, which is known as the current LFO pop-up menu, and right now there's only a 1. By default you only get 1. You can create per Alchemy up to 16, and you can access them with the previous and next arrows here. Those can be created obviously as you set your modulators and you set your different targets. Let's say if I have a knob here and want to add some modulation, I want more LFO, new LFO, then you see I have two. I have this sine LFO or this number 2, which is still the same sine wave, and you can also refer to my previous video when you go to show target and see you have an LFO 1, which is a sine, and it's on these two different targets, and then that LFO number 2 that I just created is going to be assigned to that target that I have selected, and so on and so forth. You can go up to 16 of those. Now to the right of that there's a file button. You can see from this list, should be very self-explanatory, there's a couple of presets that you have available to you that you can use in itself, or you can use them as a starting point and tweak them. And once you do that, you can either save, copy, paste, and this is just general manipulation of files and parameters, right? But you can also clear that whole LFO module and start from scratch. If you do a save, right, you're going to be brought to this window where you can name your LFO file, and it's going to be saved inside Alchemy's LFO folder. Then it's going to become a preset, if I'm not mistaken, that's going to be available to you from this list, which is pretty handy if you obviously want to use it later and you want to have a starting point for later. Now, down here there's these two buttons. One is called trigger and one is known as the bipolar button. The trigger button, you're gonna turn on to re-trigger the LFO. When it's turned on, I should say. That means that the LFO is gonna start again from 0 with each new note that you're playing. When the trigger button is off, the LFO runs freely. You are tying this functionality that I just explained, or I should say that functionality that I just explained is tied to the actual parameters, which are delay, attack, phase, and then a rate. I'm gonna get that in a second. The bipolar button, when it's on, the LFO outputs from negative and positive values per cycle. So from minus 50% to 50%. When it's off, then only positive values are going to be outputted by the LFO, meaning 0 to 100. And that's all it means. Right to the next pop-up that we have here, it's your shape pop-up menu. Not much that I can say here other than there's a big list of them. You have a check mark to the left of the category and the actual waveform that you have. In this case, we have a basic sine wave. You can see the two check marks. I will not go through each and every one of them at this point, but what I do want to do at this point is just to get this out of the way, is just talk to the actual category a little bit so that if it's not obvious enough, you get an idea. Basic, very obvious, you just have come waveforms. And when I say waveforms, you can visualize them here as you go through each one of them. You can see there that its shape. So it's good because you can see it in that window, and that will give you a good introductory explanation of what it is or how it's going to behave if you're into oscillators and that type of thing, that electronic stuff, right? Basic is just common waveforms. You have all of those in there: ramp up, down, random glide, and the normal, most basic ones like a sine wave, square wave, or a triangle. Complex is going to give you a variety of complex cycles, sweeps, and patterns that you can use to create regular or irregular patterns for LFO modulations. This is good because or useful because there's a lot of popular music today, as you may or may not know, that has a lot of variations and sweeps going from the intro into the actual main section of the song, and that's a good way of practicing how to create those, right? And create your own, save them, have them available for later. Random patterns, this gives you another variety of complex LFOs that let you introduce randomization. The serial slash or serial hyphen angular is just a list of step shapes, so they're gonna look like steps, and that's why you have squares and saws in here. Serial smooth are going to be complex rising and falling patterns, and that's why you have sine waves with ramp ups and downs. And then this tri-serial and tri-ramp up and down is really just that, just ramping up and down. That's how I can summarize it to you. The ultra high frequency, it's category waveform shapes that contains multiple copies of a pattern. So the modulation speed is a multiple of the speed set by, you guessed it, the rate knob. And speaking of the rate knob, let's talk about then the knobs that are down here, which are the actual parameters, the actual life given element of the LFO. Delay is gonna introduce a delay between a note on message, or when you press a note, and the first cycle of the LFO. That's true when this trigger mode is on. When it's off, the delay has no effect on the LFO. Then the attack knob fades in the LFO output to increase modulation depth, which is again that knob over here. The longer you press a note, then that is true. Guess what? When the trigger mode is off, attack has no effect either. Both of these guys have an adjustment setting that starts at 0 and ends up at 20 seconds. So you can add a delay anywhere from that range, or you can also increase your depth of modulation when you're attacking, when you're pressing a note, from 0 to 20 seconds. Then to the right of that, it's the phase knob, and that's just gonna tell you where at what point of the LFO you're gonna start, either from 0 or to 100%. And very easy to understand, I think. The rate knob is no different from rate parameters that are present in other synths, in Logic and any other program, as it's gonna be attached to the sync button here. So having said that, what does the sync button do? The sync button, when it's on, is gonna synchronize your LFO with the tempo of your song. So that's why this rate knob would go from a particular measurement tempo wise, right? That's gonna be like in the quarter notes, it's the like the mid ground default. You can go up or down as you move the knob. If the sync it's off, then your rate is not gonna be in sync with your tempo. Therefore, you can go from 0, in this case, to 220 hertz. That's pretty self-explanatory there. A little thing that I wanted to say is that when sync is on, right, your rate is going to be set in beats and sub beats, as you saw. That's why it's called that it's in sync with your tempo, because you're telling the LFO, okay, you're going to be in sync with the different beats that I have. Therefore, it's going to follow the tempo, whatever it is. You can put your tempo up or down and still going to fall into that measurement. If it's off, then that will not apply. And last but not least, there's this waveform window that's just going to show you real-time changes to the LFO waveform or shape. So I have a sine wave, and if I select a square, I'm gonna see a square. If I select anything other than, I'm gonna see it. I'm gonna see its shape. So it's a good way of visualizing what's happening. So for example, if I go to let me see if I can find a sweep here. Like, let's see. Well, sorry, a sweep. So there you see what that is doing. It's creating a sweep effect, and that's how it's graphically represented, which is good because it gives you a visual idea of what's happening with the LFO in your project and in the target that you have selected. Okay, so with that, I'm gonna leave you for this tutorial. Thanks for all the support as usual. I will see you in the next video. Peace out, YouTube.